One, two, three. Three count four.
Hello everyone, I am Be Better Gamer, and welcome to Be Better Gamer Wrestling. This channel is dedicated to wrestling video games fueled by my love, passion, and obsession for them. Today I am bringing you a WWF No Mercy Let's Play episode, continuing along my path for the Women's Championship to 100% all paths, I should say. And I am going to be playing as none other than Trish Stratus. If you haven't seen my other WWF No Mercy Let's Plays for the Women's Championship, I've already done one on Ivory, on China, on Lita, and now I'm going to be playing as Trish Stratus, probably one of the most popular women wrestlers ever to compete in WWE, and definitely the most decorated women's champion of all time in WWE. She's been a 7-time WWE Women's Champion. She's even held a hardcore championship one time. And right now you see I'm adjusting the height and weight because in WWF No Mercy they don't put the height and weight on all the women wrestlers. Again, I don't know why that is. I'm also going to change her outfit. I'm really excited to talk about Trish in this episode because, you know, I was always a fan of Trish, but what really is interesting to go back and look on around the time of WWF No Mercy, you know, she's in this game, obviously, and the Trish that we all know now, you know, 7-time women's champion, WWE Hall of Famer, having her great rivalries with Lita and Victoria and Jazz and Mickie James, and I'll talk about those rivalries in a bit. But when this game came out, Trish had just recently appeared in WWE. You know, she actually, you know, was a fitness model. She started out as a fitness model and was scouted by WWE, and she began to train as a wrestler. She debuted scouting out Test and Albert, and then she would form TNA with them. Obviously, we all know what the TNA stands for. Impact Wrestling made their whole promotion after TNA. But that's when she started. She started as a manager in 2000, and she wasn't a wrestler. You know, she wasn't a wrestler. She was brought in as a manager. She was brought in for TNA. It was the Attitude Era. The way they viewed women's wrestling was a lot different than it is now. But I think the crazy thing about Trish is probably no one expected this woman who was a fitness model and was brought in pretty much for eye candy, pretty much to just be hanging around all the guys and managing them, because she would later go on to like manage Val Venus after TNA. Probably no one expected her to be the most popular female wrestler, as well as like the most accomplished, and also ended up being really good in the ring. You know, her overall time in WWE wasn't really that long if you think about it, but if you think about the fact that she came in as a non-wrestler and would transform into one of the best wrestlers they had on their female roster, I think that's pretty incredible, and that's one of the reasons why I really like Trish Stratus a lot. And you know, if you watch any interviews with her, if you watch any of like the WWE like documentaries where she talks about her time in WWE, she mentions that you know, her drive to be taken seriously as a wrestler, to go out there and have good matches. And you know how I like talk about the historical context. We're gonna go over sort of the timeline of her journey and see how WWE, in my opinion, had a really good thing with the women's division around the early 2000s. You know, and I've mentioned this in my previous Let's Plays. They had a lot of really good, solid female wrestlers, along with Trish. They had Ivory, Lita, Jacqueline, Victoria, Molly Holly. You know, they had a bunch of them. And somewhere along the line, they got lost. Somewhere along the line, they really went, you know, 100% towards that TNA with the Diva search and bringing in women who weren't wrestlers and having them be the stars. Meanwhile, you had all these other women wrestlers like Trish, like Lita, cutting their teeth and putting on good matches and trying to make something out of the women's division. Obviously, flash forward to now, when WWE really prides itself on their women's division and the talent they have there. It's interesting to see that change, because I think that if WWE had embraced had embraced the women's division, when you had Trish and sort of all her contemporaries coming up, not only could we have skipped all that Diva Surge stuff, but Trish probably would have been 10 times better than she ended up being, and she was already really good. So I mentioned she started out as a fitness model. She actually made her first in-ring debut on an episode of SmackDown in a tag match with TNA versus Lita and the Hardy Boys. That was one of her first feuds, was with Lita, and they would have a storied rivalry. You can even watch WWE rivalries on the WWE Network and see that. And here we go. Here comes Terry Runnels coming out. But there's a lot in common with Terry Runnels in this game and in Trish in this game because, like I said, Trish wasn't really a full-time wrestler at this point. I modeled her outfit a little bit after, maybe her 2002, 2003 ring attire. And her moveset in this game is a little all over the place. With some of the women wrestlers, I feel like they just gave them random moves because they didn't really know what to give them. We don't have Trish's finishers in this game. We don't have the Stratusfaction. We don't have the chick kick. Even though you probably could do the chick kick. I want to one day re-edit some of the wrestlers in this game, not just the women wrestlers, but some of the other wrestlers on the rosters, and give them other moves. So maybe I'll do that one day, and Trish will definitely be one of them. But in 2000, she started out feuding alongside TNA against Lita and the Hardys. After she was done managing TNA, while she was managing TNA, I should say, she started managing Val Venus, and she briefly challenged for the Women's Championship. Her first pay-per-view match was for the title, was at Armageddon 2001. It was a triple threat that only lasted a minute and 40 seconds. A minute and 40 seconds, Armageddon 2001. It was a triple threat with Ivory, with Molly Holly. Ivory was the champion. A minute 40 seconds, just let that sink in. I mean, all throughout the 2000s, you would have some women's matches go just a little bit longer than that, but that was probably kind of the average, and this was the women's championship match, and this was early on in Trish's career. This was her first pay-per-view match for the title, and we're gonna see how that changes. But that's pretty much what they had her doing right after feuding with Lita and the Hardys for a little bit. But she wasn't really wrestling, those classic matches yet with Lita, because she didn't have a big wrestling repertoire yet. She wasn't fully, she was trained as a wrestler. See, here we go. Her special in this game is the big Stephanie McMahon slap. And speaking of Stephanie McMahon, the next big storyline that involved Trish was she was inserted with a storyline with Mr. McMahon and the McMahon family, where Vince McMahon was, basically having an affair with Trish Stratus in front of Linda McMahon, who he had broken down so much that she became sort of in this frozen mental state of shock. And he would do these things in front of Linda, like make out with Trish in front of Linda. And Stephanie disapproved. She was angry at Trish. She was angry at her father. And that actually led to a match at the No Way Out 2001 pay-per-view between Trish and Stephanie McMahon. Now, this would all culminate this is all really building up Mr. McMahon's character. You look back on it without context, and it does seem like a lot of it's done in poor taste. And it is, and a lot of it is done in poor taste, but the whole build-up of it was for Mr. McMahon to get his comeuppance at WrestleMania 17 during a street fight where Shane McMahon came back to fight for for his mother's honor. By that time, Stephanie actually had reunited with Vince, and Vince had cast out Trish. She was betrayed by Vince in a way when Stephanie realigned with her dad, and Vince said he was only using her basically as a sexual object, and he was tired of her, and he didn't want her around anymore, and he would go out of his way to embarrass her and do embarrassing things, make her strip in front of everyone. And all of this was to build up Mr. McMahon as a horrible person. And then at WrestleMania 17, not only did we get the awesome moment of Linda McMahon rising out of her wheelchair to kick Vince McMahon in the nuts, but also in that match, Trish turned on Vince as well, smacking him and leaving his side. And that really began the journey of Trish as a wrestler and as a babyface. You know, she came in as a heel manager, and then she aligned herself with the McMahons. But during that whole scenario, she became a babyface, and she would actually start challenging for the women's championship as a serious member of the women's division. You know, she would wrestle a bunch of matches, but she did have a brief injury, and that took her away for a few months. But she made a big return at Survivor Series 2001, where she won her first women's championship match. It was Survivor Series 2001. It was a six-pack challenge. It was Trish, Ivory, Jacqueline, Jazz, Lita, and Mighty Molly. Look, just listen to those names: Trish, Ivory, Jacqueline, Jazz, Lita, and Mighty Molly, aka Molly Holly. This was the first of her 7 WWE Women's Championship reigns. It's the most number of reigns, actually, out of all the women and out of all the women's titles that WWE has had, including the Raw's Women's Championship, the SmackDown Women's Championship that's going on now, and also the Divas Championship. No other woman has held the title 7 times. The most number of reigns after 7 is Mickie James with 5 for the WWE Women's Championship. So Moolah was technically the first, you know, WWF Women's Champion. So she technically has like the longest reign of days combined out of all her title runs, because she held it for like decades. But there's a lot of controversy with that and how that's, you know, how basically she owned the rights to the championship, because originally the women's championship was called the NWA World Women's Championship. It was part of the National Wrestling Alliance, and Moolah held the rights, and she rarely, if ever, lost it. And the times she lost it weren't really recognized as losses. So if we don't count that, if we don't count all of the Moolah stuff that happened, Trish, with her 7 reigns, held the title for over 828 days altogether, and that would make her the longest reigning champion if we're not counting Moolah's reign. So let's just say she's the longest reigning champion in the modern era of WWE, which is a record that's still held today in most number of reigns. She has the second longest individual reign. You know, it's the longest reign of the 2000s, but she has the second longest individual reign. Nikki Bella has the longest individual reign for the Divas Championship at 301 days. AJ Lee is second with 295. Nikki Bella just beat her out. To put that in perspective, Alexa Bliss has held the WWE Raw's Women's Championship for 223 days. So Trish, 448 days. That's a pretty big record to have. Asuka for the NXT Women's Championship, she held it for 510 days. So that's why I say it's the second longest individual reign of the modern era, because Asuka's reign was 510, and Trish, during her 6th reign, she held it for 448. You know, Charlotte and Sasha, speaking of, are tied with 4 reigns for the new Raw's Women's Championship, which was the new Women's Championship. So they only need 3 more wins, and either one of them need 3 more reigns, and they could tie with Trish Stratus for having 7 reigns for a women's championship in WWE. It's kind of complicated if you think about it, even though, you know, so going through all that, it's a little bit complicated with all the different women's championships that have been in WWE. But that was her first win. That was her first win at Survivor Series 2001. You know, I talked about it in my chat. There we go. Big brain, a super brain buster from the turnbuckle is her corner special. Trish never did a super brain buster from the corner turnbuckle. It would have been awesome if she did. But I mentioned this in my China Let's Play. The title was pretty much dormant in 2001 after Mania. China was the champion, but she didn't really defend it all that much and left the company around this time, so the title was vacated. Also, Survivor Series 2001 was Jazz's WWE debut. This was during the whole, you know, alliance angle. and she came in as a ECW alumni and immediately joining the alliance. At Vengeance 2001, she defeated Jacqueline, and then at Royal Rumble 2002, she defeated Jazz. And she held it for about 78 days before losing it to Jazz on an episode of Raw. And Jazz was Trish's sort of first main rival. Like, yeah, she feuded with Lita when she first came in, but Jazz was like her first main rival, revolving around matches and wrestling and revolving around the championship. And I think that helped Trish a lot, because if you're familiar with Jazz, I was a big fan of Jazz. Familiar with Jazz was no joke. Jazz was so good. She was great in ECW. She was great in WWE. I always loved her intensity, but she was a really good wrestler, really well seasoned. So I think going in there with someone like Jazz really helped Trish, and you could see Trish's intensity every time she would go in. Yeah, she would come in, her music would play, and it would have that little laugh. But even in those early, in that early year of her having her first women's championship, every time she got in the ring, she was very serious. And having someone like Jazz, who was very intimidating and obviously, more experienced than Trish, I think it helped Trish a lot. They would have she would have her first WrestleMania match at WrestleMania 18, and it was a triple threat match with Jazz and Lita. And here we go. Speaking of Lita, we're fighting Lita right now in a ladder match. How fitting, a ladder match between Trish and Lita for the women's championship. This was Lita's only WrestleMania match. I talked about it on her Let's Play, WrestleMania 18. And they had the tough spot of trying to follow Rock and Hogan that night. So the crowd was kind of dead afterwards. I think they just burned all their energy after Rock and Hogan. But it was a really good match. It was a really solid match. I recommend go back and watch it, because it was one of what's the word I'm looking for? Most significant women's matches at that time, because up until that point, WWE wasn't really doing anything with their women's championship, and a lot of the WrestleMania matches that featured women before that, they weren't all that special. The WrestleMania before was just a squash match where Chyna squashed Ivory in like 2 minutes. So it was a really tough physical match. Jazz retained, surprisingly, but Jazz retained. She got her big WrestleMania win. That's cool. But at Backlash 2002, Trish would face Jazz again, but she would lose. She would finally get the women's championship back from Jazz on an episode of Raw. But it was, with a weird stipulation. It was a hardcore tag team match. It was Trish teaming up with Bubba Ray Dudley to face Stevie Richards and Jazz. And the hardcore title was also on the line for Richards. Insurrection 2002, Trish and Jacqueline would defeat Jazz and Molly Holly. And she would defend her title at Judgment Day against Stacy Keibler. So this is like sort of the first of a few instances where Trish, as champion, is going to be defending her title against another female in WWE that's not really a wrestler. Stacy Keibler, unlike Trish, she did come in also as a manager and as eye candy. Unlike Trish, she never really evolved into that serious wrestler like Trish did. She would lose the title to Molly Holly at King of the Ring 2002, but get it right back at Unforgiven 2002. And all these pay-per-views are pretty much like the only times you're seeing these women matches on pay-per-views. Every now and then, alongside these matches, it's like a bra and panties match, or some sort of stupid stipulation involving some of the other women on the roster. But really, with Trish and her feuds with Jazz are really where you're starting to see the women's wrestling trying to break through, trying to break out. And I think a lot changes when Victoria shows up. Victoria shows up right around this time, and she has her first pay-per-view match at No Mercy 2002. Very fitting, No Mercy 2002. And it's Victoria's first WWE pay-per-view match. And she played, this psycho character, which is kind of a trope for WWE to use with their female characters. But it was very effective with Victoria because, like Jazz, Victoria was a seasoned wrestler. She had done a lot on the indies. And she was really good. And she actually had sort of a legit personal feud with Trish that she could use for the storyline. It wasn't a real feud. They didn't really hate each other, but they did have some history about their both past lives as being fitness models. Victoria and Trish did know each other in the past and did sort of try out for WWE around the same time, and WWE used that to help their feud, and Victoria sort of being this very obsessed, psycho, jealous opponent to Trish. But they had some really great physical matches, and I loved Victoria. I talk about Victoria a lot in these Let's Plays, but her feud with Trish I thought was excellent, really well done. And the match that really sticks out for me is their Survivor Series 2002 match, because it was a hardcore match for the Women's Championship, and it was a very physical, intense match. And not only did it make me love Victoria even more, because I pretty much loved her as soon as she showed up, but it also, I remember at that time, really opening my eyes to Trish, because she took kind of a beating in that match. And it's when I really started like taking her seriously and saying, and like thinking like, she's no longer that, manager that showed up about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, alongside Test and Albert. She's so much more now. But she would lose the title to Victoria at Survivor Series. At Armageddon 2002, she would have a triple threat match with Victoria and Jacqueline. Victoria would keep it, and then she would be in another WrestleMania triple threat with Victoria and Jazz. I actually like this triple threat match more than the previous year's triple threat. I thought this triple threat match was really good. It was Trish's second WrestleMania appearance, and once again with Jazz in there, but this time Victoria. Lita was gone. Lita was missing because she was hurt. But this would be Trish's moment to shine at WrestleMania. She would win the title. It would be her fourth and shortest title reign, not including her last, because she retired after her last. And then she would lose the title again to Jazz at Backlash right after. So that's why it was her shortest title reign. At Judgment Day 2003, there'd be another fatal four-way between Jazz, Victoria, Jacqueline, Trish. At Insurrection, it'd be Jazz and Trish again. So a lot of again, Trish, Jazz, Victoria. At Unforgiven 2003, Lita's big return. She would come back. It'd be Lita and Trish against Gail Kim and Molly Holly, and WWE really messed up with Gail Kim. They could have kept her around, considering everything she's done in Impact Wrestling. They really missed the boat with Gail Kim. And as I talked about in my Lita Let's Play, this was her big return from injury after being gone for about a year because of neck surgery. And Lita and Trish would form a union. They would form a partnership. A few months later, it would be Trish and Lita going up against Chris Jericho and Christian. They would have this sort of battle of the sexes at Armageddon 2003, and they also had a intergender tag match at Raw. It's something that a lot of people wonder, will WWE ever go back to doing intergender matches? It seems like they've been sort of slowly headed back in that direction, I think, with their mixed match challenges. Also, obviously, this past year's WrestleMania, you had Ronda Rousey and Kurt Angle against Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. And although the rules for these matches that they've been having, these mixed matches that they've been having nowadays, the men aren't supposed to fight with the women at WrestleMania. Ronda Rousey was lighting up Triple H, and it got one of the biggest reactions of the night, if not the biggest reaction of the night. But back then, WWE used to do quite a few intergender matches, and I like intergender matches if they're done well, if they're done right. This was a fun one. They definitely allowed Trish and Lita to shine a lot against Chris Jericho and Christian, and the fans were really behind Trish and Lita. But the storyline really would evolve into a romantic storyline between Trish and Jericho and Christian. And at WrestleMania 20, Jericho and Christian are basically fighting over Trish in a way. And so Trish wasn't on the card. She wasn't wrestling. She showed up at the end of the match, causing Jericho to lose, and then fully turning on Jericho and continuing her storyline with them after that. If you're not familiar with the WrestleMania 20 card, there was two other women's matches on that night, It was Victoria and Molly Holly in the infamous hair versus title match, and then an evening gown tag match with Tori Wilson and Sable against Miss Jackie and Stacy Keibler. So it's what I like to say what WWE does when they go one step forward and two steps back, because I really feel like around this time, Trish and Lita, they would really be the most popular women on the roster, really showing a lot of what the women's division can do in terms of wrestling in the ring. And here we are at WrestleMania, a year later, after a really good triple threat match. We're getting an evening gown match and then a really short match for the women's championship. So, but Trish would get to wrestle at Backlash in a handicap match with Christian against Chris Jericho. And, you know, looking back on it, going through the sort of the timeline and seeing Trish develop, it almost seemed like this was like sort of like a stopgap in sort of Trish's progress, because here she is now sort of once again playing background to the male wrestlers. And it was kind of lame to see, honestly, you know, in retrospect. But she would be reinserted into the women's championship scene and start her 5th reign at Bad Blood 2004 in a fatal 4-way match against Gail Kim, Lita, and Victoria, who was the champion at that point. She pinned Lita, and she was the first woman to become 5-time champion. She was fully healed by this point. Only Mickie James, like I said, has won the title 5 times as well. And this would sort of begin the really big Trish and Lita rivalry that we all know. At Unforgiven 2004, first though, she would defeat Victoria. And then at Survivor Series 2004, she was supposed to face Lita, but Lita attacked her and the match was basically thrown out. And this was the feud. This was the feud that we all remember, that we all love, between Lita and Trish, that would lead to Lita versus Trish as the main event of Raw on December 6, 2004. And I talk a lot about this moment in my Lita Let's Play, so I'm not really going to go over about it too much again, but I really recommend go watching it. It was an exciting match. The crowd was super into it. It was Trish and Lita, I wouldn't say at their height, but definitely getting there and really showing like what was possible with the women's division, that they could be a draw, that they could be a very popular attraction alongside the men. And, you know, it only took WWE like 15 years to finally get to that point when I felt like they had it. They had it at that point. They had it in 2004. They had it in 2003. They even had it a little bit in 2005, but that's where they really kind of lost it, was in 2005. But it was Lita's own 2nd title reign, the 2nd time she won it after like 3 years. At New Year's Revolution, Trish would get the title back from Lita though, because, and again, I talk about this in my Lita Let's Play, Lita got hurt during the match, and the original finish of the match was for Lita to retain, but she tore her ACL during the match, and they had to kind of call an audible, and Trish became the champion. It was her 6th reign, and it was her longest reign she ever had, like I spoke of towards the beginning of the episode, 448 days. And this is where it starts sort of, you know, going down a little bit in the women's division. After, with Lita getting hurt at WrestleMania 21, Trish would end up facing Christy Hemme, who was, you know, the winner of the 2004 Diva Search. You know, and she did a Playboy spread for WWE, and it was the only women's match on the card. You have to wonder that maybe if Lita didn't get hurt, we would get Lita and Trish at WrestleMania. Maybe they do something crazy. Maybe they would have done a ladder match, you know what I mean, at WrestleMania, the first ever women's ladder match at WrestleMania. Like, you know, who knows? Who knows what they could have done? Who knows what the plans could have been? At least we got Kurt Angle and Shawn Michaels that year. But you know, her pay-per-view schedule in 2005 was dramatically different from 2004, 2003. It's not like she was on every pay-per-view to begin with, but she was noticeably absent in 2005, and part of that was due to her actually being injured, but they didn't take the title off of her. They allowed her to stay as champion. She would return to pay-per-view at Unforgiven 2005 in a tag match with Ashley, another WWE Diva Search winner, against Tori Wilson, again, much like Stacy Keibler, a kind of a non-wrestler, and Victoria. So Victoria's still around. you got Trish there. Lita's hurt. There's not really anyone else left. Gail Kim would leave pretty soon if she wasn't already gone by this point. Ivory was gone. Jacqueline was gone. Molly Holly would be leaving pretty soon. The women's division wasn't what it was. Here we are like 2 years later, and it's really a shame. It's really a shame that WWE decided to, go forward with really embracing the quote-unquote divas division and doing these diva searches where they were very clearly not hiring athletes. They were very clearly not hiring women who they wanted to be wrestlers. And here's Trish, who's probably now like really comfortable, really seasoned, clearly the best female competitor in the ring. If you watch her matches around this point, easily the best thing. Still has that intensity, still has that fight to show that she's the best. And she's surrounded by a bunch of non-wrestlers. And Victoria, Victoria's still great, and it would kind of be, held there for a long while. At Survivor Series, she would defend her title against Melina, until Mickie James shows up. And when Mickie James shows up, that's when they start slowly doing the storyline of Mickie James being this sort of obsessed fan, this stalker. And it would lead to a rivalry, a feud that sort of walked the line, I thought. And I thought they did it actually pretty well. Walked the line of this stalker who was obsessed as a fan, but was crossing the line and really invading Trish's personal space and kissing her inappropriately and touching her inappropriately. And it wasn't done in the way like to make it like hot and sexy like WWE tried to do a lot of times when they would have women touch each other. It was really done in that creepy, uncomfortable way where you can see Trish really bothered by it because she's like, oh, this person's psycho. And it really made for a compelling story because it turned the tables. Usually, again, WWE would do those psycho storylines with the women chasing after the men or the women just being psycho. And this seemed a little bit more real, because you do have sometimes those people who become a little too obsessed and take things too far. And how do you handle that? And the way Trish handled it was having great matches with Mickie James because every time they went in the ring, they had awesome matches. And I think the Trish-Mickie James rivalry is my favorite rivalry in Trish's career. They would have that first match at New Year's Revolution on pay-per-view. It wasn't their first match, but it was their first pay-per-view match. And then they would have the big match at WrestleMania 22 against Mickie James and Trish for the title, where Mickie James would win. She really shined in that match, and the crowd started getting behind her. Even though she's supposed to be the crazy psycho villain in this storyline, the crowd was really getting behind her, and it was a great match. It was probably the best women's match at that time in WWE. Now again, I've talked about this in my other women's championship matches. These women matches, they're no All Japan women's wrestling, in the early 90s, but for what WWE was doing, they were really good, with Trish and Mickie James, and I think at that time, probably the best women's match. Flash forward now, we have so many of them, but it was kind of rare to see, so it was a breath of fresh air to see Trish again competing with someone who was on her level, who can keep up, and also have a really good, compelling storyline between them that felt personal, that felt real, that wasn't, oh, I'm jealous because you like this guy and I like this guy. It kept it about them and their relationship, and I thought that was really compelling. They would have a rematch at Backlash where Trish actually got hurt mid-match and they had to end the match early, seemingly. I mean, you see the ref throw up the X sign and everything, so I'm assuming they ended the match early. Mickie James got DQ'd, so it seemed like that was probably an audible. I don't know, maybe. But in the late summer of that year, Trish would announce her retirement, and she wanted to have one final match against one of her other long rivals, Lita, who returned from injury again, after getting injured with Trish, and she won the title from Mickie James to have that last match against Trish at Unforgiven 2006. Trish would be going into it as a babyface. Lita would actually be going into it as a heel. You know, this was right around the beginnings, sort of, or the middle. I always forget of the whole rated R superstar thing she did with Edge. But it was in the Air Canada Center in Toronto, Canada, and it was a fitting end for Trish's WWE career. Well, you know, she did make a few appearances after that, but it was her actual final last match. You know, that's what it was publicized as. And she won the title, which is different. You don't see that a lot of the times with wrestlers who are leaving or who are retiring. You don't really see them losing in their last match. But she won in her last match in her hometown, pretty much. She's from Ontario, Canada, actually. But she's in, you know, Toronto, Canada. And she won with the sharpshooter, which the crowd loses it for. They love it. They love that part of it. And you know, she would make a few appearances after that. She had another WrestleMania appearance in a wrestling match, in a tag match with John Morrison and Snooki against Lay Cool. But the less we talk about Snooki is probably for the better. And then, of course, she was the number 30 entrant in the recent Women's Royal Rumble, the historic Women's Royal Rumble. She eliminated Mickie James, she eliminated Natalya, she helped eliminate Nia Jax, and then she got eliminated by Sasha Banks. I like to believe that we might see another Trish Stratus return soon. I hope we do, because I think with the current crop of women wrestlers that WWE has now, I think she can have some great matches with them. So let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about this episode. Let me know what you think about Trish Stratus, if you think she will be coming back and performing, what you thought were some of her moments in WWE that were your favorites. And yeah, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Make sure you check out my other Let's Plays. If you want to catch me on Twitch, I'm at twitch.tv/BeBetterGamer. Anyway, thanks again. I'm BeBetterGamer. Until next time, keep watching all the wrestling.